All right, we are back on College Football Addiction, talking about this three-way race. I know Pitt's just right there on the outside, but a three-way race for a three-way tie. You really got a four-way tie right now, but not possible to continue that as some of these teams do play each other. But Pitt up there as well, and certainly controls their own destiny, can win out and go to the ACC championship. And so we'll talk about them in just a moment. But this weekend, when you look at the three teams that we continue to talk about with this possible kind of chaos scenario, all three won again this weekend with differing levels, varieties of difficulty. Clemson beat UVA in a game that was close for a half. Clemson pulled away, got a little close two-score game there at the end, and then Clemson scored again to make sure that it was a little bit more. I think they won by 17. So never really in doubt. Miami beat Louisville. Another game that was never really in doubt, but a very close game, a really fun game, probably the game of the week in the ACC. And then SMU trounced Stanford. I don't know that surprises anyone. All three teams won. Now we're 1 week closer to the ultimate ACC scenario of a three-way tiebreaker. A quick recap, if this is your first time, all three teams are undefeated in conference. All three teams are favored in the rest of their games, and none of the three teams, Clemson, SMU, Miami, play each other. The tiebreaker would come down to opponents' records, so it would be out of Miami's, SMU's, and Clemson's hands. We've broken down week by week who would be in. Last week, it was Miami and Clemson that would be in if the season ended today. This week, we do have a change there. I'm going to tell you who to root for here in just a moment if you're a fan of one of these three teams. But every week, we do get asked about two questions. Number one, what about Pitt? And number two, what about Clemson and SMU losing games earlier in the year? Now, first of all, Pitt, like I said, controls their own destiny. And what they've done this year has been super impressive, not trying to take anything away from them. But because they play both Clemson and SMU, the three-way tie would be impossible for Pitt to be part of. If Pitt beats both, they'll play Miami most likely in the ACC championship game. If they split with both, the team that they lose to would likely see Miami in the ACC championship game, assuming that Miami wins out. But don't get mad at me, Pitt fans. Again, just because you're not part of this specific scenario doesn't mean that we're not going to talk about you and cover you. There's just no way for it to work out for any other three teams to kind of be this unique scenario. In fact, we're working on getting a Pitt expert on this week to try and talk about their chances this season and this upcoming week. So Pitt fans, hit the subscribe button for me. Miami, SMU, Clemson fans, I know a lot of you already are, but make sure that you hit that button for me as well. It doesn't cost you a thing, but it certainly helps us out here on College Football Addiction. Second, what about Clemson's loss and SMU's loss earlier in the year? Well, they were both out of conference. Clemson lost to Georgia. Really good loss at this point. Georgia looks like one of the best teams in the country, obviously. And the loss to BYU by SMU was also out of conference. The ACC doesn't consider out-of-conference losses when deciding their champion. Just like the SEC, the Big 12, the Big 10, the Pac-2, they don't consider out-of-conference losses. You might think that's dumb. I know the Miami fans are kind of frustrated with that. Hey, we won our out-of-conference games, but at the end of the day, that's just kind of how college athletics work. Obviously, in the NFL, MLB, NHL, NBA, they look at overall records, not necessarily divisional records, but this is how college athletics works. So we do have a change in opponents' overall records. And so when we look at these, we exclude the Florida State and Louisville games since all three of the teams in consideration, SMU, Clemson, Miami, play those teams. The remaining opponents for Miami are 10-11. The remaining opponents for Clemson are 9-11, and SMU's are 8-11, meaning that we have a change. Clemson and Miami would be in the ACC championship if the game was taking place this weekend. But there's still a ton of time left in the season. And as we've said the last 2 weeks, and we'll repeat again this week, this is our third time doing this, and this is the third time we've had different teams represented. Miami was out the first week, Clemson was out the second week, SMU out this week. Don't be surprised if it continues to jockey. And we'll have a more clear idea as we get to the end of the season. But again, our third time doing this, we're still on pace for this becoming a reality. Some of you said I was crazy for starting this series a few weeks ago, but again, we're a week or two away from it becoming incredibly realistic. So we need to talk about who you guys should root for. But first, I do want to talk about how realistic this truly is. When you think about it, people keep saying, well, one of those teams is going to lose. And I agree with you. The likelihood is that one, if not maybe even two, or maybe all three teams end up losing. But here's what ESPN says on an FPI projection. FPI is not the end-all, be-all. It's just a really useful metric when you're looking at the strength of a team. These FPI metrics also very similarly model what we see when Vegas odds come out. If a team has a 90% chance of beating another team, they're probably a 2 to 3 touchdown favorite. Well, Miami has 5 games left in the ACC. They're a 91% chance to beat Florida State. They have a 90% chance to beat Duke. They have a 72% chance to beat Georgia Tech. They have a 95% chance to beat Wake and an 82% chance to beat Syracuse. Now, the Georgia Tech and Syracuse games are on the road, so could things get tricky there? Sure. Florida State is a rival. Even as a Florida State guy, my hopes there aren't very high for the Noles, but Miami's not like completely out of the woods yet. But you'd look at those 5 games and you'd say Miami shouldn't lose any of them. And then we look at the next team, SMU. SMU has a 75% chance to beat Duke. They have a 76% chance to beat Pitt. We'll talk about Pitt here and again in a moment. They have an 86% chance to beat BC, 75 against UVA, and 81 to Cal. Now, again, could they slip up in some of these games? Pitt's a really good team. Certainly that could be a team that gives them some trouble. Duke's 6-1. Could they slip up in one of those 2 or maybe one of the last 3? Absolutely. But when you look at it, you start to think, well, I don't know that I'd pick them to lose any of those games. And so they could certainly go 5-0. They're going to be favored in all 5 games. And so maybe it's not too crazy. Fortunately, they get the Pitt game at home. And so you look at SMU and you're like, well, yeah, they certainly could go 5-0 down the stretch. And then we look at Clemson. Clemson only has 3 games left. They have Louisville at home off of a bye week, and they're a 67% chance favorite to win that. Then they have Virginia Tech on the road. To me, that's their toughest. They're a 67% chance to win that one. And then they have Pitt as well, 71% to win that one. Clemson has some of the lower percentages on here. But with only 3 games left, I don't know that I would pick any of those 3 teams to beat Clemson outright right now. Things can't change for sure. But people ask, how realistic is this, TJ? Could this really happen? When you start to look at some of the percentages and you start to look at what lines would be and what favorites would be and all of these games, I think most of these teams are 2-score favorites against about everybody else they play. Maybe the Pitt games are a little closer. Maybe Virginia Tech's a little closer because that's on the road. But I think you probably pick each of these 3 teams to win every single game. Now, there's still 13 games left between these teams that we're talking about. And so are you going to pick them to go 13-0? Boy, that'd be a heck of a parlay. But as the weeks get closer, after next week, there's just going to be, 10 games left? Week after that, there's just going to be 7 games left? Week after that, there's just going to be 4 or 5 games left? And you start to get closer to say, man, this could happen. For a quick reference point, Pitt has several games left. They've got 6 left in the ACC. 69% chance to beat Syracuse, 23 to beat SMU, 66 to beat UVA, 28 to beat Clemson. Louisville, they have about a 25% chance of winning that game. The game against Louisville, which is maybe a little bit surprising. That one is on the road, though. Louisville, tough place to play. And then 54% against BC. This is why you can see we haven't necessarily been giving Pitt the same attention in this series as the other teams. Again, it's statistically impossible for them to be part of a 3-way tie, and they're going to be an underdog probably 3 more times. If they win all 3 of those games as underdogs, they are going to the ACC championship, I would imagine. So hats off to Pitt if they can get it done. But that's why we haven't been hating on Pitt. They're just not kind of thought of as the other 3 teams are at this point. Now, Clemson only has 3 games left. We talked about that. While SMU and Miami both have 5 each, Clemson's 3 games are probably the toughest 3, though. So maybe that's good for them that they have less chances to slip up, but maybe it's bad because they play tougher competition. We will know the answer to that soon. That's also why I've told you I thought that Clemson has the best chance of the 3 to get in. There are only 3 more guaranteed losses for Clemson's opponents, if you think about it like that. Miami's going to hand their opponents 5 more losses. SMU is going to hand their opponents 5 more losses, assuming all 3 went out. Well, Clemson's opponents only have 3 more guaranteed losses, and they're some of the better teams in the conference. And so that, to me, is going to help Clemson when it all comes down to it. This will end up being a race against Miami and SMU if the teams keep winning. That's my projection, right? Now, certainly things could happen. Clemson could come out and lose their next game, and then they're kind of out of it. But we'll see. Now, who to root for? The last 2 weeks, I've made a mistake in each video, and each time the comments have called me out on it. I need your help. If I screw up on this, let me know down below. I triple-checked this one. And so I'm hoping that we got it right. If we didn't, just let me know. I'm a human too. Now, First game, you got Syracuse and Pitt. Miami should root for Syracuse because they're the only team that plays them. And then Clemson and SMU play Pitt, so they should certainly root for the Panthers. It'd be fine to root against Pitt too, since you are trying to get a leg up and they're undefeated. But for those other teams, they do control their own destiny since they play Pitt. And for this experiment, you certainly want it to continue on this way with them cheering for Pitt. Also, a higher-ranked Pitt win would be good for both of them if an at-large was possible. Miami and Clemson don't play BC in the next matchup, so they should cheer for Louisville, and SMU is the only team to play BC, so of course they should cheer for them. Miami's the only team to play Georgia Tech, so they should cheer for them. The other two should cheer for VT. Now, SMU is tricky there. Why did I say that they should cheer for VT? Because they play both. Again, my thinking is that this is going to come down as a race between SMU and Miami. If that's the case, then I think they would be better served to want Miami, things to be worse for Miami than they are for Clemson. You want Clemson to move up. That way they just take the first place, and you want Miami to move down because you have to play Miami. So it hurts Miami more if Virginia Tech wins than if Georgia Tech wins. So that's why I took that one. And Clemson's probably going to finish first anyway, so let's just let them go ahead and finish first, take the second place, because that's your best path if you're SMU. That one is gray, though. It's probably not going to make a huge difference either way. We'll know more later. UNC is obviously who Miami should cheer for because the other two play Virginia. Other two obviously cheering for UVA. Miami plays Wake, and SMU plays Stanford, so that's who each team should cheer for. Clemson, again, tricky here on both of these. I'd say for them to cheer for Stanford because they're chasing Miami at the moment, and then this could help get them back ahead for the time being. Again, this is a gray one because they don't play. It doesn't matter as much. Well, no, they do play both, but it doesn't matter as much because one team plays each. I would lean Clemson cheering for Stanford. If you have a different take on that, certainly let me know down in the comments. And then the last two are pretty obvious. Florida State and Miami, obviously the Canes want to win, and then the other two want Miami to lose to get them out of this. SMU and Duke, same thing. You certainly want the Mustangs to win if you are the Mustangs, and the other two want them to lose to get them out of this three-team tiebreaker. Now, what happens later if there's a loss somewhere? What happens if all three teams have losses? That's a question we've gotten quite often on the channel here. I don't have a great answer for that. If one team has a loss, then you're just going to have the other two. Maybe Pitt sneaks back into it, and you could get something weird happening. You could get Pitt in a three-way tie with teams with one loss potentially. You could maybe have a four-team race with everybody having a loss. If Miami drops one, you could have Miami undefeated, the other two having one loss each, and then it's a fight with three teams for second place. There's a lot of different scenarios. As of now, it's hard to do scenarios based on who might lose or who they might lose to, or if it's a common opponent, this, that, and the other. Like if Clemson loses to Louisville and the other two beat Louisville, then they're just automatically in, even if the other two pick up a loss. There's a lot of different scenarios there. Way too many to try and think about theoretically. We have one pretty simple one pretty easy one with all three teams undefeated at this point. If that was to happen, we will start a new content series. I will break it down. It'll be a ton more work. It'll be a ton more confusing. We'll have way more graphics, but I will do it. I'll keep monitoring what's going to happen in the ACC. It is pretty fascinating. People have asked about doing this for the SEC, the Big Ten. What if there's tiebreakers there? Here's why that probably doesn't matter to me as much, and I'm not saying I wouldn't do it. There's no like sure thing ties. There's a lot of head-to-heads and things that have to happen. Tennessee plays Georgia still. Texas and Texas A&M play. Like there's some of this is going to get resolved. LSU plays Bama. That'll get somebody out of the mix. And so it doesn't matter as much. And the SEC is going to get way more at-large bids. The ACC is definitely more precious when you're thinking about like trying to get that at-large bid. If you're a 12-1 ACC team or an 11-1 ACC team, like, are you confident they're putting you in over a 10-2 Bama? I'm not. After last year, certainly I have a bias there, and when I'm thinking about it, but in the SEC and the Big Ten, I don't think it matters as much because, okay, you had a tiebreaker and you didn't get in at 11-1, you're going to the playoff in the Big Ten or the SEC in that scenario. So I might do it for them as we get closer. I think it's a little more important in the ACC because you do have three teams, maybe four teams with Pitt that probably are somewhat deserving at this point in the year of a playoff bid. But people are going to get hurt feelings because the ACC is not looked at the same. Now, Pitt loses a couple of games to SMU and Clemson. They're certainly not deserving at that point. SMU drops another one somewhere along the way or loses in a conference championship. That might be tough for them. But, Miami loses a conference championship game. Are they putting in a one-loss Miami over a two-loss Alabama? I think they should. I don't think Miami should be penalized for going to the ACC championship and losing to a top 10 Clemson team. But are you confident that they do? Are you confident the SEC isn't going to put that team in? I'm not. Just being very fair with you. Clemson gets left out on percentage points and goes 11-1, and they lost to Georgia when Alabama beat Georgia. You confident, Clemson fans, that they're going to put you in after last year? You think that you feel good about it? So that, to me, the ACC is a little bit more important. The winning of the ACC is more necessary to get in. Texas goes to the SEC championship and loses to Georgia in a rematch, they're in. They ain't worried about it. And so that's why we've been doing it with the ACC. Hey, let's talk about it down in the comments. I appreciate you guys a ton. This has been a fun series to do. Maybe a little bit of a distraction for me as my team is at the bottom of the barrel in the ACC. I guess Cal's down there, maybe a little bit lower. But this has been a fun distraction. I've enjoyed this. I'm all here for your suggestions, your comments, your questions. We get some trolls on here too. That's fine. I don't mind it. But yeah, if you have really legitimate questions or concerns or thoughts or I screwed anything up, let me know down in the comments. I go through these pretty fast and it's a lot of information. And so sometimes I just misspeak. If that's the case, we'll certainly try and fix it and correct it in the next edition. But it's another big week. Only 2 of the teams play. When you look at the 3, Miami has the rivalry game against Florida State, SMU with the game against Duke. I expect both those teams to win. I think Miami and SMU win, and then we'll recap it all next week if the 2 teams are victorious. If they're not, we'll talk about kind of some other tiebreakers or things that might happen. We'll continue this series one way or the other unless it just becomes a no-doubter in a couple of weeks. But I appreciate you guys a ton. Again, do me the favor of subscribing if you made it all the way through a 15, 16-minute video about this. You certainly kept, if I was able to keep your attention this long, hit the subscribe button. And we appreciate you for joining us here on College Football Addiction. Excited for what this race is going to shape up to be. Thanks, guys.